Hello and welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a Screencast-O-Matic audio-visual recording for the part of the lesson from Unit 3, Lesson 2, analyzing more about symbols and values and norms. In this particular part of the lesson, we're going to be looking at the issue of monumental battles in regards to, of course, how certain Americans look at certain symbols, in particular the Confederacy, with things like Confederate statues of Confederate generals from the Civil War, and also the Confederate flag. Before I get started, please let me encourage you to open up to the correct part of today's lesson and to answer the key concept questions that appear on the Google Doc. Let's go ahead and get started, and remember you can replay any part of this presentation for clarity later. Monumental battle. Why a movement to topple Confederate monuments has sparked debate, protests, and even violence. Protesters dressed in camouflage and gripping assault rifles gathered near a city park in Charlottesville, Virginia in August. They had assembled for a rally of white supremacists, people who believe the white race is superior to all others. They were in Charlottesville, their leader said, to march against the city's plan to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from the park. But they weren't alone. Counter-protesters who opposed their views linked arms and marched toward them. The two sides clashed. First with angry chants, then with water bottles, fists, and pepper spray. As chaos erupted, a car driven by a alleged Nazi sympathizer plowed into the counter-protesters, killing one and injuring 19 others. Despite the turmoil, Charlottesville still plans to remove the Lee statue, although opponents have filed a lawsuit to try to prevent that from happening. Charlottesville is hoping to follow the lead of other cities, including New Orleans, Louisiana, that recently took down Confederate monuments. In May, after years of controversy, New Orleans dismantled 4 massive Confederate statues, including one of Lee, who commanded Confederate troops during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. The removal sparked angry protests and lawsuits. We haven't really dealt with the legacy of the Civil War and slavery. The battles in Charlottesville and New Orleans are just 2 recent examples of how the fight over the meaning and legacy of the Civil War is still playing out more than 150 years later. We never addressed the legacy of the Civil War or slavery and what it means to the country now and what it meant then, says Alvin Tillery, professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University in Illinois. The movement to rid public property of Confederate symbols has been growing since June 2015, when 21-year-old Dylan Roof, an avowed racist who openly embraced Confederate symbols, murdered 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina. Also immediately, debates about Civil War monuments heated up in places such as Richmond, Virginia, St. Louis, Missouri, Austin, Texas, and Jacksonville, Florida. South Carolina later removed the Confederate battle flag from its capital in Columbia, and Alabama took down the flag from a Confederate memorial on its Capitol grounds in Montgomery. Not just stone and metal. But the push to remove Confederate symbols has spurred passions on both sides. Many of those who want them removed say that they present a distorted view of the nation's past. These statues are not just stone and metal, says New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu. The monuments, he says, celebrate the overly simplistic view of the Confederacy, while ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, and the terror that it actually stood for. Some of those opposing the removal, including the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville, are members of hate groups who believe that the white race should have power over all the other races. To them, the Confederacy represents a time when whites were firmly in control. Others who support keeping the Confederate monuments have other concerns. They say the history of the South is being erased. Memorials like this one, the one to honor Lee specifically, to honor the bravery of the Southerners who did battle in the Civil War, they say, in their view, the Confederacy fought in part to defend states' rights against the overreach of the federal government. Pierre McGraw is among those descendants of the Confederate soldiers who says the statues stand for the pride and heritage of men who fought for their freedom. It's not just fair to judge historical figures by today's morals, and that's what's being done, says McGraw. President Trump joined the debate after the events in Charlottesville, defending Civil War monuments in a series of tweets as part of America's history and culture. Trump also blamed both sides, white supremacists and the protesters who opposed them, for the violence. His remarks were widely condemned by both Democrats and Republicans. Views of the Civil War. The modern battle over Confederate symbols stems partly from very different views of the Civil War and why the North and South waged it. When the war began, the Southern economy was mainly agricultural, relying on a few million slaves to harvest cotton. Most historians agree that the war started because the South's desire to continue slavery. However, not everyone agrees with that interpretation of the war. Some say the South fought primarily for the right to decide its own affairs. After the North won the war, Southerners and groups in the South commissioned monuments to help promote that view of the conflict. Many of the memorials portray Confederate soldiers as selfless heroes and don't mention slavery. For example, the inscription on a Confederate monument recently removed in St. Louis reads, "With sublime self-sacrifice, they battled to preserve the independence of the states." Honoring Confederate bravery wasn't the monument's only purpose, says James Grossman of the American Historical Association. They also served to rally white Southerners who resented the political and social gains African Americans achieved after the war, including the right to vote, he explains. This map right here is something I would reference later, by the way, when you get a chance to look at the number of Confederate monuments in the Southern states specifically. In the 1870s, Southern states began passing Jim Crow laws restricting the rights of blacks and segregating them from whites. Over the next few decades, hundreds of Confederate monuments were erected as violence against African Americans escalated. So the building of Confederate statues surged again in the 1950s and 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, Grossman says, and although blacks were making strides toward equality, there was still resistance to change in the South. Today, many find the monuments offensive. Zenaya Bryant, an African-American 11th grader in Charlottesville, feels the history of slavery shouldn't be celebrated. The city's Lee statue stirs up feelings of hurt and fear for Bryant, who petitioned the city to take down the monument. "I am offended every time I pass it," Bryant wrote to city officials. "I'm reminded over and over again of the pain of my ancestors." But many of those who support keeping the monument say their motives are about honor, not race. "When you start removing the history of a city," says Robert Bonner, a Civil War reenactor of New Orleans, "you start losing where you come from and where you've been." Confederate tributes. So several states, including Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, have passed laws banning the removal of any monument on public property commemorating a historic figure or event. Lawmakers in Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas are considering similar legislation, but not all officials agree. Charlottesville's Vice Mayor, Wes Bellamy, says that the Lee statue, "We believe that it's not a statue or memorial that should be in the city of Charlottesville, certainly not in a public place where people who are paying taxes are deeply offended by these statues and memorials." So at least 60 Confederate monuments in the U.S. have been removed or renamed in the past 2 years, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Nearly 700 remain, spread across 31 states from California to Delaware. Many other Confederate tributes exist across the U.S., including schools, streets, and mountains, honoring figures like Lee, General Stonewall Jackson, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In August, the U.S. Army declined a request from a black congresswoman to rename the streets honoring Lee and Jackson at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, New York. An Army official called any effort to change the names controversial and divisive. So telling the whole story. Hoping to avoid such battles, officials in some places have opted for other measures. One approach has been to add more information to Confederate monuments with background about the people depicted and their legacies. For example, officials at the University of Mississippi kept a controversial Confederate statue on campus but added a description, and the plaque reads, in part, "Although the monument was created to honor the sacrifice of local Confederate soldiers, it must also remind us that the defeat of the Confederacy actually meant freedom for millions of people." But even this approach, known as contextualization, putting the monuments in historical context rather than replacing them, isn't without challenges. It took 2 years for university officials to agree on the final wording, and small signs may not be enough to counterbalance every monument, critics say. Other cities have created new statues honoring African Americans rather than eliminating Confederate ones. In Richmond, a statue of black tennis star Arthur Ashe overlooks the city's famed Monument Avenue, along with Confederate generals Lee and Jackson. "I want Richmond to tell the whole story of its people," Mayor LeVar Stoney recently told Time, "not just a one-sided story." So as you guys can see, the whole benefit, if you will, of talking about symbols in our culture is that it really gets us thinking about the deeper underlying values and, I guess you could say, history of certain parts that you may not otherwise think about. Only time will tell whether or not we will continue this movement to take down Confederate statues or, of course, ban or outlaw possibly Confederate flags, a really highly controversial topic, especially when you talk about changing a deep part of what we have been through as a nation and what people view as their right to expression. So thank you very much for tuning in, and remember you can replay any part of this presentation that you might need for the completion of this lesson.